Hello, I'm Yoram Hazony, and this is a special edition of NatConTalk. Like all of you, I've been following developments in the United States with increasing concern. The unfolding suppression of political speech in America is like something out of our nightmares. It could very well put an end to the United States as we've known it. In fact, it could put an end to the entire free world. And that's something we're going to have to think very carefully about in future episodes of this show. But before we even go there are things that have to be said about the riots at the Capitol building in Washington last week. As you probably know, I've played a role in the nationalist revival that's been taking place in America and in other countries over the last few years. I wrote a book called The Virtue of Nationalism. Some of you may have read it. And in that book, I argued that a world of independent nations would be better for all of us than the borderless, globalist utopia that's been promoted by most American and European leaders for the last 30 years. In fact, since the end of the Cold War. In 2016, voters in the UK and in the US rejected that utopian one-world globalism. The British voted for national independence from the European Union, and Americans voted for the America First agenda of President Donald Trump. Over the last 5 years, I've repeatedly argued that this nationalist revival was, on the whole, a very good thing. I thought it was good for the United States and Britain and for other countries to go back to emphasizing things that have been neglected for a very long time. Things like national independence, national borders, looking out for the interests of the nation as a whole, and making laws that are in keeping with the nation's history and its traditional way of doing things. I believed in all of those things, and I still do. And that makes me a nationalist, a national conservative. And because I am a nationalist, I want to share with you my views about the Capitol riots on January 6th. As you already know, last Wednesday was the day the Senate of the United States was scheduled to certify the election of the American president. But as they assembled to do that, the American Capitol building was attacked by a mob and vandalized. 2 people were killed before order was restored and Congress got back to doing its job. I understand that many Americans have doubts about the integrity of the voting in several states in the American election in November. Having doubts is legitimate. In a democracy, the right to appeal results of an election is an inseparable part of the political system, which means that President Trump and his lawyers were 100% within their rights to bring forward whatever evidence they had so that the evidence could be examined by judges, state officials, and state legislators who were in a position to invalidate the results if they thought the situation called for it. Now I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say, because I've been a nationalist conservative my whole life. And there's no one who would have been happier than me if the Republicans had held on to the White House and the Senate, and if they'd managed to flip the House of Representatives too, for that matter. But the attempts by President Trump and his lawyers to appeal the results of the election in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and other states were in the end a complete failure. Lawyers for the president were unable to present the kind of evidence that would have convinced a judge or a state official to overturn the results of the election in even a single state. I understand some of you think things should have gone differently. That's your right. But the reality is that there weren't enough Americans who agree with you to change the results of the election. Now, if you're a nationalist, that means you stick by your country even when things aren't going the way you think they should. You honor its laws and its way of doing things, even when you think your fellow citizens are wrong in a big way. President Trump has said repeatedly that America first means putting America's interests before those of other nations, and he was absolutely right about that. But America first also means putting America's interests before those of your own political party and before those of your preferred candidate. Here's the most basic thing that every nationalist understands in his gut. That when there's an election coming up, you compete with everything you've got. And when the election's over, you unite to face the common threats to your people. And that's the responsibility of both parties. The party that came out on top and the party that's hurting bad because they just lost. It is precisely that nationalism, that patriotism, that love of America, which President Trump expressed so powerfully in his Mount Rushmore speech and in his speech to the people of Poland and in other key addresses of his presidency. And it's precisely that nationalism, that love of America, which should have meant that when the appeals process was over in the courts and in the states, President Trump should have thrown in the towel and said loudly and clearly, "You win this time." Now, I'm aware of the history behind this thing. I know very well that 4 years ago when President Trump came out on top, the Democrats never really conceded the election. And then instead of putting America first and uniting the country to face common dangers, they declared a resistance that made America ungovernable for 4 miserable years. And it's true. That disgraceful, sickening performance did set the stage for a contested election and for millions of people asking themselves today whether they can trust American democracy any longer. But if you're a nationalist, you aren't jealous of the lawlessness, the looting and the arson, the destruction of historical monuments and statues, the murder of cops that the other party encouraged in America all last summer. You don't look at all that and say, well, now it's my turn to take up lawlessness and violence and killing cops. No. If you're a nationalist, you say, all right, you win this time. And then you get to work figuring out how to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Now, maybe all of this wasn't clear to you a month ago, but now you've seen what happens. Now you know how the whole story turns out. And if you're a nationalist, then there's got to be a lot of things that are clear to you right now. Like, for instance, that President Trump should not have called on Congress to override the decisions of the courts in the states once the appeals process was over. He shouldn't have said he would never concede. He shouldn't have told people that there was a way that they could stop the steal in the Senate and that he could stay on as president, because there never was. He shouldn't have spoken at that rally the day the Senate was supposed to certify Joe Biden's election. And he shouldn't have told his supporters to head over to the Capitol building. Like, why? To do what? What were they going to do there? Nothing. There was nothing that they could have done there. But he sent them over anyway. He did these things anyway. President Trump did these things, and together they were the worst mistake of his presidency. Now, it's true he did not call on that crowd to riot, to smash into the Capitol building and to kill that cop. But it happened anyway. And the entire nation and the entire world got to see President Trump's own Stop the Steal rally, egged on by the president's reckless rhetoric, turn into a mob attack on the Congress, one of the central symbols of American democracy, of American nationalism, and American strength. And because of that, suddenly everything that we nationalists have always said that we're against was exactly what those idiots running amok in the Congress turned out to be perfectly happy to be doing there. We nationalists have been saying for years that we're against destroying national monuments. Yet there they were, destroying national monuments. We've been saying that we're against dishonoring the history and traditions of the nation. Yet there they were, dishonoring the history and the traditions of the nation. We've been saying that we're against political violence. Yet there they were, engaging in political violence. We said we detest people who abuse law enforcement and murder cops. Yet there they were, fighting with law enforcement and murdering a cop. So if you really want to know what caused the intense, wall-to-wall revulsion against what happened at the Capitol last week, it's just this: that those rioters, encouraged by the president, were the absolute opposite of what any nationalist or any conservative or any patriot would ever want to be. I remember a couple of years ago when President Trump told a rally of Americans, you know what? I'm a nationalist. Use that word. Use that word. But you know what? It turns out that just using the word isn't enough. It isn't enough to say that you're a nationalist. You've actually got to act like a nationalist, which means someone who loves his country so much that he knows when it's time to stand down. America is still a great nation with astonishing achievements to its credit and a remarkable inheritance to pass on to future generations. But right now, things are not in a good place. The woke ideology that's taken over the institutions of old-school American liberalism is an appalling and dangerous force. It's going to do a lot of damage, a lot more damage, before it's through. Conservatives and nationalists, together with old-school anti-woke liberals, we've got an awful lot of hard work ahead of us if America is going to make it through this. And each of you is going to have to help. Make sure you remember this. The cause of America is the cause of all free nations. It can't be allowed to fail. And the last thing America needs right now is more political violence, more vandalism and looting, more contempt for the law, more idiots running around carrying guns and waving them at people. So wherever you are tonight, say a prayer for the United States of America. May God's grace shine on the United States.